Joe Biden's approval rating has hit a new low. It's at about 40%, if that. So the guy is at the lowest level we've seen for an incumbent in over 30 years. In fact, the closest we have to this number is actually George H.W. Bush circa 1992, which he got clobbered by Ross Perot in tandem with Bill Clinton. And in fact, we also have another number, which is that in 2008, during the recession, during these overextended wars that nobody liked at the time, George W. Bush had a better approval rating than Joe Biden does right now. So as you can see above, we see that Biden sisters are down bad. As you can see, Joe Biden's approval rating is at 40.3 versus 55.7 disapprove. That's a negative spread of 15.4, which means that there's a lot more people that dislike him than do like him. What's horrible about this is that we know that more than 40% of the country is liberal, and yet not all of them approve of the Biden administration. And when you're supposed to have a incumbent advantage, you're supposed to already have that preset floor of a base support group, and he doesn't really have that in full. So this is on the back of Trump winning the popular vote by 3. Now, what's interesting about this, of course, is that Joe Biden was leading Trump by a lot at this point last election cycle. He was up by 5.5, and he still lost. He only won 4.5% of the popular vote in 2020. He was up 5.5. And so if he's going to do a point worse, if you carry that over, then Trump wins by 1.3. And that's assuming it's a 1v1, which we know it isn't. In fact, when we put in the other candidates, all of a sudden, Trump is going to be up by like 2. And so that's very interesting because, as y'all can see, Kennedy is polling at 8.8% right now. And while he is falling apart at the seams, what it does seem to be doing is hurting Joe Biden, because if you look at what he's been doing recently, look at where the priorities are for Joe Biden. Kennedy family makes clear that it's Biden endorsement in an attempt to deflate RFK's candidacy. So as you can see here, we're having a betrayal of blood over politics, because obviously the Biden camp knows that they're losing voters due to RFK at the end of the day. And so whether that be 9% of the popular vote, or when he peaked at, let's say, 18%, or whether it be a measly 4% of people voting third party, that still is a negative for Joe Biden. And he knows that, which is why he's getting the Kennedy family to backstab their uncle, RFK. And look at how desperate he's getting. The reason why RFK in particular existing is an anathema to Joe Biden's reelection prospects is because we can tell by the way he's acting that it is a negative for Joe. Because if Joe Biden really thought that RFK were taking votes from Trump, he would just let the sleeping dog lie. But instead, he's trying to aggravate this sort of pretension by going to his family and soliciting their endorsement when it's supposed to be taken from Donald Trump, if that makes sense. So, I mean, if it were a negative thing for Donald Trump, then he would have just left it alone. Why open Pandora's box if you're okay? Curiosity kills the cat. And so that is endemic, and really just showing to the people on Twitter that are like, oh my God, RFK is going to screw over Trump. Well, let's look at what the incumbent president is doing. And as you can see, Joe Biden's desperately trying to get the Kennedy vote out of there because he knows he's losing support. And it's evident that the president only has 40% approval, which is less than what a normal average Democrat would have, obviously, if half the country's Democrat, more or less. The reason being, folks, is because that 40% co-aligns with 8.8% also going to RFK. Because what that means is that there's let's say the country were 50-50 Republican Democrat. There's about 10% that are voting RFK, 40% that are voting Biden, and then 50% that are going Trump. You see how there's a 10% gap? And where is that being filled by? Well, it's being filled by RFK. So isn't that significant? So clearly he's taking more from Democrats than Republicans. And sure, it may only be a 60-40 split, but 60-40 split from 8.8% is like 1.5, if that makes sense. So that's a net 1.5 in the popular vote change. Also, Biden has been surging in some of these polls, which means he's like getting less underwater, so to speak. The guy's been going from, let's say, negative 15 to negative 11. The point being is that there's some Democrats coming back to the plantation. And who's losing the votes? Is Trump losing votes? No, it's Biden gaining votes and Trump staying the same, and RFK bleeding votes. Well, isn't that showing that RFK voters are mostly pulled up like Joe Rogan, circa 2012 Obama Democrats that are now kind of apathetic to the whole thing? These Aaron Rodgers types that might be coming home to Biden because they're scared of Trump. But isn't that kind of interesting? Because not only does it show that Trump has the lead if you have people that are apathetic joining back to their daddy, Biden, but also the fact that these are Democrats that would have voted for Hillary but are so disaffected by how crappy the Democrats themselves have been running this country for almost 4 years that they themselves are going to jump off the bandwagon and then now are only scurrying behind their guy at the last minute. Now, if we recall the Donald Trump election in 2020, there's opinions that differ from each other. Obviously, we know, the votes get counted differently than what they were voted as, if you know what I mean. But that being said, the end result is that Biden was elected, so we'll just concede that. But listen, so Donald Trump's approval rating around time of re-election was about 45%. That was barely cutting it for re-election. It was really drawing it close because then it becomes a game of turnout when you're in the upper 40s. That being said, let's say he lost with 45%. You think Joe Biden's going to win with 40? How? How? And some MAGA boomers might be like, well, they're going to do it again. They're going to miscount the vote. Okay, look, listen. For them to do that again would mean that they would have to triple the amount they were doing it. Okay? So if you recall, in Georgia, when they shut down the counting of whatever because of their water main breaking or something, they had to, create a psyop and distract people for hours to get tens of thousands of votes counted differently, maybe, hypothetically. But if Trump wins Georgia by 100K this time, legitimately, because he's in the lead in Georgia by, let's say, 5%, what are they just going to stall for an extra 6 hours and count them? Like, you know what I mean? Like, there's only so much you can, finesse. And I'm using euphemisms, but it's true. And so let's look at the facts. All right. Presidential job approval ratings of incumbents seeking re-election. Okay. So Obama in 2012 was at a 46%. And then right at the election, he was at a 52% and he won. Not by a lot, but he won. So think about that. At 46 and he won, not by a ton. And Biden's at 40, even. George W. Bush in 2004, 49% approval rating with the Iraq War, okay? And Afghanistan. His approval rating right before the election, 48%, and he won. Again, upper 40s gets you reelected. In case of Obama, in case of Bush. Well, guess what? Biden is at 40%. At 40%. Okay, looking at Bill Clinton, 55%, 54%. He won by a lot. That was Ross Perot as well. George W. Bush, he lost by a lot. Okay, well, what was his approval rating? 37%, 34%. Well, guess who's a little bit beyond that? There we go. Joe Biden. Joe Biden. Wow, interesting. So he's closer to George H.W. Bush than he is to Obama in terms of re-election polling. But we're expecting this guy to win. Okay, now Carter, 32, 37. He got murdered by Reagan. Okay. What about Ford? Ford had an approval rating of 45% and barely lost to Jimmy Carter. Now, what's super important about this, of course, is that Donald Trump had a similar number and barely lost to Joe Biden in the Electoral College. And so keep that in mind. Now, those are the numbers that are relevant. All right, so you can see already that historically, Joe Biden has a almost no percent chance of winning. It's about the odds of LeBron winning the championship this year, which is not looking good. But anyway, we're going to see what's going to happen in 2024. Before we wrap up, let's look at the specific polling numbers and see why things are going bad. On the economy, Joe Biden is polling at negative 18% on average. Now, let's compare that to where Trump was. Now, if we look at the prior approval for Donald Trump, you'll notice that he was always higher than Joe Biden for the most part. Joe Biden's at negative 15.4. And by year, by the way, his spread on the first term was negative 10, and he barely lost. Okay, now negative 13.5, negative 10.7, negative 9.9, negative 8.7. And that's at the face of Biden at negative 15, by the way. Now, let's look back at these specific topics. Foreign policy. Joe Biden on foreign policy is polling at a negative 25%. Okay, well, what about inflation? They say it's getting better. He's at a negative 29% on inflation. As recently as last week, he's at negative 30%, according to the Economist. There, folks. Okay, crime. Okay, life or death. Joe Biden is polling at negative 19% on crime. What about immigration, Trump's number one issue? He's polling at negative 31.1, folks. Ukraine. He's polling at negative 13.3%. Okay, direction of the country as a whole, the most generic question possible. Joe Biden right now is polling at a remarkable negative 38%, folks. And that plus more is why Joe Biden is on track to get absolutely shellacked and destroyed like the Nazis in Normandy. Okay, just a complete massacre. It's kind of sad. But anyway, Joe Biden bros down bad. We love to see it. See y'all in the next one. Adios.